Hello, welcome to the third part of Visions of the 21st Century. In this we move to a radically different perspective. Instead of looking at the crisis of the 21st century simply materialistically, in terms of wars, economies, ecologies, divisions and political situations, we're going to look at the emerging metaphysics to see if a new view of consciousness is possible. And we shall end by looking at the possibility of an integrated human being. So we've moved radically to the spiritual area rather than just simply the materialist area in order to get an interdisciplinary perspective on this whole evolving crisis. Because there's also a crisis in our consciousness. There's also a desert in the soul. Some of these questions that we're taking in include, to this section, can we recover the meaning of consciousness? Can the destructive aspects of our nature be understood and transformed? Can we recover our soul, an animus mundi, the soul of the world, within a meaningful cosmos? And can we find a path of individuation, to use a term of Carl Jung, in the psyche? Can we transform, therefore, not just our political and economic systems, can we transform ourselves? And on a metaphysical level, can the cosmos be ensouled at a new level? Now, great examples in the West of pioneers who have attempted to create a new meaning for consciousness and a meaning for the soul in the new bottles, as it were, the old wine, remember? The old wisdom in the new bottles and the new containers that is required for the 20th and 21st centuries. We of course mention Jung, Carl Jung, as we've mentioned right throughout the Quest series, who provided not only a worldview, but a psychology, a depth psychology, and indeed an ethics. Because within the psyche, he discovered that there is an ethical foundation to it. There is a purposeful, meaningful development towards a higher self, towards an individuation process. We also have looked at other key thinkers in the realm of depth psychology, who have, as it were, plummeted into the depths of the psyche to see if there is a natural religious impulse inside, spiritual impulse inside human beings. I say spiritual because not everyone likes the term religious nowadays because it connotes organizations and churches. But is there an autonomous, natural, spiritual impulse inside human beings? So if we look at the work of Stanislav Grof, for example, we can find that tracing back right into the birth process and even into the womb, the development of the child takes place in a transpersonal manner at the beginning of its life, that there is an archetypal foundation to the psyche, and that the experience of birth profoundly affects the infant, the baby, throughout the whole of their subsequent life. And when they recall it as an adult, they recall it in archetypal terms. It's as if the transpersonal and the archetypal surround us and surround consciousness at all levels. We also look at the continued growth of Eastern practices in the open competition of religions for the soul. The West, in its search for spiritual sustenance, has increasingly turned to the East. Some people have said, including Jung actually, that the Western man should not look for a deep incorporation of the East because, as it were, the West and the East are fundamentally different. However, the evidence of the past 30, 40 years is that increasing numbers of people have looked to the Eastern esoteric and not so esoteric in terms of their religions, like Buddhism, for example, and also the esoteric in terms of their mysticism, which is in the East often openly allowed and encouraged, has looked to these sources for spiritual understanding and growth and have incorporated them into their practices in the West, yoga, meditation, of course, being famous examples. Now, we have incorporated in our Quest series a meditation practice which many of us have carried out following the secret of the golden flower, and it's an example of incorporation of Eastern practices. And in this meditative practice, which is explained in this ancient text going back in the written form to the 7th century AD, but probably before that, back in oral history, back into the time of the I Ching, and way back before the time of Christ, that the sources of Chinese understanding of the psyche, their spiritual understanding of the psyche, can be found in these texts. And the reason why we chose it is because this particular text and this meditation advice actually corresponds to a lot of what we've discovered, and certainly what I believe exists in the human psyche, and I've discovered in psychotherapy, and not just me, but many others, that there exists not only darkness in the human psyche, but light. And this light circulates. And it's the circulation of the light, as if through the various chakras of the deep psyche, that this circulation of the light is the process of transformation and growth. And it's this circulation of the light meeting the darkness which leads to our growth. So there's an incorporation of the darkness, and there's a meeting with the light, as explained in The Secret of the Golden Flower, and it's aided by meditation practices. So that is an example of how Eastern Oriental ancient wisdom can be attached and incorporated and integrated with the findings of depth psychology in the West. Now, there are 4 diagrams which you can see on the accompanying slides, which are taken from Richard Tarnas, who wrote that book we studied called The Passion of the Western Mind. And in it, in some of his later writings, in these diagrams, he uses a simple diagrammatic explanation for what has happened to the soul, or the self, in ancient times as it moves into the modern world. And he portrays the self, or the soul, as an open system connected in a participation mystique with the rest of the nature and the world and the cosmos. It is, as it were, porous. It allows the outside world in. The outside world is animated in terms of archetypes, in terms of sacred meaning, in terms of numinosity. Gods and goddesses may be everywhere in very ancient peoples, and these are become part of the psyche. Likewise, those parts of the psyche which are felt intensely filter out into the world and are projected into the world. The human being therefore exists in some form of participation, some form of unity with the world. As we move into the modern self, the soul, or the self, becomes reduced in size, and the outer section of the world becomes deadened. The world is seen increasingly as unalive, or as dead, and not as animated. And the only animation that exists within the self. So it's a very isolated existence, so to speak, that human beings begin to live as they become separated off from the animus mundi. The self, therefore, becomes reduced as we move towards the modern worldview. But even in the religions, of the great religions, or like Christianity, particularly the Abrahamic religions of the West and Near East, we find that the self becomes the centre of the only action, the only meaning that there is. And the greater nature and surrounding world becomes really deadened and unsouled. And God is, as we see in the 3rd diagram, God is a transcendent force, as it were, above extraplanetary force, above the world, and the self is encapsulated within its own world as a small space. So in the final diagram, he shows that the self is actually reduced to a very tiny state. And it's ironic that as we've gained more and more knowledge in the 20th and now 21st centuries, the expansion of our consciousness has gone out towards an understanding of life and nature and the cosmos and the forces of physics and chemistry and science and so on. This expansion, these accelerating worlds of knowledge, which we touched upon in the first part of this lecture, that instead of the self expanding, the self has become smaller. And that the human being and even our planet is seen as infinitesimally small in a vast, vast universe, which if we deprive of meaning by saying it's just an accident or it's dead essentially, and life has emerged accidentally out of this universe, then it follows too that our consciousness has emerged accidentally. And therefore consciousness, our true essence, is deprived of any sense of meaning. It's here by accident. So the self is reduced to a small area of meaning in a vast and increasingly dead cosmos, or cosmos which is there, as it were, by accident. So paradoxically, the more we've understood, the less important we are. Now, there is, however, despite this movement into the modern world and the reduction of the self and the reduction of the soul, this desert of the soul, desert of meaning, desert of metaphysical significance, or our position in the cosmos, or our position in nature, in this desert of the soul, the wasteland as T.S. Eliot called it, there is in the late 20th century and early 21st century, nevertheless, a new metaphysics emerging. There is a new movement towards a spiritual understanding of ourselves and the universe. The cosmos is on the point of becoming ensouled once again as we gaze out into black holes which are apparently creating new universes. As we gaze out at the origins of our universe and realise that we are part of some infinity of universes which have always existed, and we are just one particular within this great infinity. At these points, not only do we gasp in astonishment and wonder, but we begin to get a sense, once again, that feeling that we're part of a greater and more meaningful whole. Now, this new metaphysics which is emerging, therefore, has, like all new religions, it's old wine in new bottles, don't forget, but all these new creations, there is a creation myth, which is in formation and is in fact greatly inspired by the very disciplines which have destroyed the previous religions. For example, our theory of evolution and our understanding of life, but particularly physics. Now, physics was one of the great destroyers, Newton and Kepler and the Copernican universe, replacing the old Ptolemaic system and the systems of the medieval church and its understanding of the world and the cosmos. This new physics, which has created the modern world, which has been fundamental to creating it, has in fact, by the 20th century, begun to suggest a new vision of the cosmos, which is inspiring many people and many authors to realise that there is a totally different way, totally different paradigm available that's emerging even from science. Matter, life and consciousness, according to this new metaphysics, this new way of looking, therefore have evolved. Yes, we're all in agreement with that. But God is manifest and immanent in evolution, as Teilhard de Chardin and Aribundo and Carl Gustav Jung all argued. There is a vast intelligence, according to this view, that saturates the void. The void of the cosmos is in fact a plenum, that is, a fullness, a plenitude. And the life system, the human body, and indeed our consciousness, has emerged from it as a meaningful development. And that our task in this new consciousness is to reflect back to the cosmos, as it were, its meaning. The cosmos, therefore, has a soul, and we are part of that soul. The quantum field underlies matter and energy, which is even the life system itself has the quantum field underlying it. The apparent void is a plenum, an underlying quantum field. And there is an implicate and explicate order, as explained by David Bohm, for example, in his book, The Wholeness and the Implicate Order. The implicate order is the underlying the creative force of the universe, and the explicate order is the phenomenal world that we observe and the forces of physics and chemistry and evolution. But underneath that, there is an implicate order underneath the explicate. There is something implicit, which is hidden from view, as Plato argued many thousands of years ago, which is an archetypal world which has formed our own world. This emerging metaphysics argues and has suggested that there are a number of incredibly fine-tuned constants that have made the universe possible. The anthropic principle that there are infinite universes and therefore one of them must be finely tuned to make life possible, so that the very people looking at the universe, the anthropos in this case, human beings, mankind, must of course belong to that one accidental universe that has emerged in order to be looking at it in the first place. This accidental view of an infinite universe, and we just happen to be here looking at it is not terribly convincing. Why go to such elaborate lengths when you could simply say that the universe has a meaning to produce consciousness, and as it were, the universe knew we were coming. The universe is designed for life and for consciousness, and our psyche is designed to attune to a universal intelligence. We are not separate, but we are a meaningful part of this vast intelligence. Some talk even of a co-creation that exists between human beings and the cosmos. Human consciousness is a constructed reality and is surrounded by a vast multidimensional field. The space-time causality coordinates, space and time and causality, as discovered by Kant, are in fact a priori categories, that is, they exist in our consciousness. They're not the reality of the world outside of us. They are the way we interpret the world and get our meaning from it. The hologram, another example of this emerging metaphysics, is a metaphor that describes the appearance of the universe out of another order entirely. According to this viewpoint of this emerging metaphysics, human consciousness has separated off from the greater self. We took Jung, for example. The consciousness has separated off from the greater unconscious, or the Great Mother. If we took McGilchrist, in his wonderful book, The Master and the emissary consciousness has separated off and thinks it's in charge of things, thinks it's king, or the master, whereas in fact the greater master, in Jung's terms the unconscious, in McGilchrist's terms the right-hand side of the brain, is in fact the part that gives its gestalt and gives the total meaning and gives it the context of things. That's what gives us our sense of meaning. Whereas the left-hand side of our brain, so given to analytics and therefore science and so on, is in fact not the area of ourselves which gives us our meaning. The modern world, according to this viewpoint, therefore, has increasingly just simply become more conscious or entered into the left-hand side of our brains, and therefore interpreted the world, the universe and ourselves from that limited point of view of the left-hand side of our brain, which is coldly analytic, unemotional, unintuitive, does not see the gestalt of things, and only breaks things up into their component parts to try and understand them. But of course, while that's a useful method, it only gets you so far. There comes a point when you need a greater viewpoint. Our consciousness consists of therefore different dimensions. Of course it consists of instinctual dimension, the unconscious, consciousness itself, as it were, our higher awareness, but also there is a higher consciousness, which has been called the transpersonal. We have a purpose in relationship to the universe, according to this new metaphysics, to develop our consciousness, respect our planet, and unite with the cosmos, and reflect back its meaning and become one with it. The universe seeks to be fulfilled through us. We are in the transpersonal realm, that is the archetypal numinous realm, at the beginning and the end, but in the middle, as it were, we are in this conscious, separated state. In this emerging metaphysics, the gods are projections of ourselves. The plenum, this vast energetic field of the cosmos, is personally invested in each individual, because it's personally invested in this precious, miraculous development of human consciousness, or indeed non-human consciousness that might be in other systems, in other parts of the galaxy or the universe. This higher consciousness is the most precious product, the birth of this, the infant child, the precious birth of the cosmos. And the myth of separation and return, therefore, which is the fundamental myth of all religions and spirituality, isn't it? That we've become separated and we long to return, or long to be reborn, or long to be resurrected, or long to unite again with the original source, is one of the most fundamental myths, archetypal myths of all religions and all spiritual movements. The implications of this are that communities, their economies and social structures require also new vision for their survival, which incorporate not only a new energy system or a new system of incorporating energy with the internet, or renewable energies and so on. All that's extremely valuable. But what is required is a total reworking of consciousness. And this emerging metaphysics might provide one of its essential components, which is this new creation myth and our central meaning, and give us back our meaning. We are meant, according to this view, no mystery to many people of course, we are meant to love. We're not here as an idle, dead piece of matter who's accidentally evolved. We are meant to love, and love is part of the cosmos. The cosmos is a great destructive and creative process, but part of that is certainly love. And this is, for many human beings, the most important thing that they attain in their life. And certainly many human beings, when they die, look back on their moments of love as the greatest points in their lives. This realization that love is central to human existence, and in fact central to the cosmos. To have produced a creature who loves, to be attached and to be integrated with others, to come alive in a fully embodied reality is our destiny. Not just collectively, but individually. Family systems in particular are our biological precious foundations. This integration that we seek between different parts of ourselves stretches even to the animal kingdom and the earth. We need to integrate not only ourselves and be integrated with our communities and our economies in a far more harmonious manner, less warlike, less competitive and less aggressive. But we need to be integrated, of course, with the planet, and we need to be integrated with other life forms, and we need to be integrated as part of a system rather than think we're the dominating master who can destroy everything, even ourselves. In other words, a deep ecology becomes part of this new vision. We are meant, therefore, to integrate ourselves, our world, and everything about ourselves. There is an implied ethical system in this new vision. In the graph, in the slide that shows the information from Washburn, he shows, from the point of view of depth psychology, a progress which I think Jung would agree with, and many in the transpersonal field, a progress of the human being from an original oneness, participation mystique as we've called it, and then some primal repression developing inside human beings, typically at the age of 4 and 5, in the Freudian analysis, the latency period, which lasts maybe up to the midlife period when things become reassessed again in the human being and a new spiritual or integrated vision becomes possible after the midlife crisis. Washburn has explained this process, this process of integration, first of all separation from the oneness in our early infancy, and then our development of our ego, which is a separated state, separates from the unconscious. And as this ego develops and thinks it becomes master, until it reaches the midlife period when it contemplates death or it contemplates its decline, then its mastery is questioned. And at that point, the ego may relinquish its apparent illusory dominance, and the greater unconscious and the archetypes and the world of the unconscious and the world of the spiritual nature of a human being may enter in, including love and including better relationship to other people, etc. So an integrated spiritual human being becomes part of the natural development of the human being across the life cycle. As it were, we start in this state, some transpersonal state, we separate off from it when our ego develops, and we become this repressed human being who is separated from our essential selves, but our ego and our consciousness and our education and our cognitive development and our understanding, etc., have developed. But that is all developing, is it not, our ego? It's all developing our separated state. And often the child is told in its educational system, you need to do this for yourself, so you'll have a better job, so you'll have better education, so that you will benefit. It's all about the ego, isn't it? It's all about you, or me, me, me. The integrated human being is not existing at this stage in the majority of the world's educational systems. Now, therefore, the vision of an integrated human being across the lifespan, which includes spiritual components, is possible. Just before we end, I think we should once again mention Carl Jung, who developed a view of individuation, that there was a natural individuation growth process inside human beings. That this is a natural organic process, and we can track it, for example, in people's dreams. That's where Jung got so much of his information, from looking at the dream world of his clients and himself, and realizing and developing a theoretical system, but realizing that there was a natural development of the personality from a fragmented state where we're all different parts of ourselves. There's part of me which is angry, there's part of me which is peaceful, part of me which is anxious, there's a part of me which is harmonious, there's a part of me which is agreeable, there's a part of me which is disagreeable, all these different parts of ourselves, which in any close analysis, most of us have, I think everybody has to admit, we consist of different parts of ourselves, an agglomeration. There's an effort to unite ourselves, to integrate, and to create this greater self. And this is a natural organic development within human beings, and as it were there is a push, an organic need which is manifested in our dreams, comes from our unconscious, pushing us in that direction. So if we have a new ethics and if we have a new religion, it should be in accord with the natural organic development of human beings that we can see in their dream world, as evidenced in Jungian psychology. What does it consist of? Well, a huge simplification, a 5-part stadial process has been described when the individual in the course of therapy, the course of development, tackles their persona, realizes that they have a persona which they present to the world, but underneath there's a truer self somewhere. Tackles their shadow next, in which the shadow components of the psyche is an enormous part of the development of a human being, to understand one's own shadow, not only individually, but also in terms of a country, collectively, in terms of any collective organisation has its own shadow. And you can see this particularly in countries, for example. You look at countries that go to war and project their shadow onto another country or onto other human beings and try and kill them or wipe them out or ethnically cleanse them. So this projection mechanism of parts of oneself, which may be the humiliated and shameful parts of oneself, projected out onto the human beings who one intends to wipe out, was nowhere more manifest than, of course, in Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And we see one of the greatest examples of evil in the whole of human history. But it can be understood in terms of shadow and shadow projection, and the history of Germany, and the history of a certain people who represented that German trauma and who tried to solve it by being supermen and therefore wiping out other people, which was part of their Aryan philosophy. The next stage of the Jungian development is typically cast in terms of animus and anima. The animus is, according to Jung, the unconscious of the female, and the anima is the unconscious of the male. So the man may have an apparent persona which is capable or striving or competitive and so on, but his anima is his female part. And in his natural growth and development, the anima, represented by a woman or female of some kind, or the female part of himself, which needs to be integrated and brought to his consciousness. So you can see within various countries how the anima maybe become accepted or not. Countries which are warlike and aggressive tend to repress the anima. Countries which actually try and engage in some decent development of human character and so on tend to integrate the anima and integrate the female parts into the male, and also allow the animus, the male part of the female, to become more expressed in the female. So Jung had a lot to say on the male and female contrasexual components of our character. And this development is called the individuation process, which culminates in this integration process in the self, which integrates all the different parts of the personality and is typically represented by mandala figures throughout artistic development, and you see it particularly in the East. Finally, we end with in this new metaphysics there is an implied ethical system which is inherent within the human being. This was shown most definitively and persuasively by Carl Gustav Jung, who showed and analysed throughout his many patients that in the world of dreams of many individuals, if not most, there seems to be some process, organic natural inbuilt process by which the psyche is pushing towards its own development and realization and integration. A 5-part process is envisaged frequently, which is represented as the persona, the shadow, the animus anima, individuation and the self, as it were, stages of the development of the psyche. In the early stages, typically in therapy, depth psychotherapy, when we take a good look at ourselves and try and change, the persona is one of the first things we become aware of, how we present ourselves to the world and how really that is not our real selves or our true self. Next stage might be the shadow. The examination of shadow is vital to understand a human being and ourselves. We have our parts of ourselves we present to the world, for example our persona, but our shadow may be quite different. We may have destructive or aggressive or unpleasant components to ourselves which we scarcely admit. Not only for individuals does this shadow exist, but also for whole countries. If we look at Germany in the Second World War, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, we see the typical movement of the shadow. Some parts of the national psyche, in the social unconscious in this case, the national unconscious, humiliated and defeated after the First World War, yet wishing to become a narcissistically compensated opposite, the grandiose Superman, the Aryan Superman who can dominate, indeed exterminate other peoples, in which the shadow, the humiliated parts of ourselves, become projected into others, and then one can try and wipe them out or oppress them. In the case of the Nazis, we see a system of ethnic cleansing, which has existed also in many other parts of the world, but had a particular severity with the Nazis. This projection of the shadow and the humiliation that one feels within, making others feel it, becomes part of a system of evil that we saw in the Second World War, and particularly embodied in Adolf Hitler. So the shadow is important as a collective thing to understand, and also as an individual. The next stage is sometimes represented in the Jungian stadial development, that is, development through different stages, as the animus and anima, when the animus, which is for Jung, was the masculine part of the woman, and the anima, which is the female part of the man, should be incorporated and understood. So in a typical male person, maybe quite aggressive and assertive, then there might be other sides to his personality, which is embodied in the female whom he projects onto his soul, his anima, and vice versa with the female. The incorporation of these unconscious parts of ourselves, which may be even contrasexual, different, as it were, gender components, into a more integrated human being who integrates these different components, who combines them in a more harmonious manner, was surely a complicated or disputed finding or proposition by Jung, but which collectively has had great implications in the Western world particularly, as the female parts of men have had to be integrated and the more masculine parts of women have allowed to be expressed. So we find this acted out on a collective level as well as just in individual therapy. The next stage that is often proposed in the Jungian system is the movement towards individuation, becoming of a distinct individual who combines the conscious and the unconscious. This integration of different parts of the human being, our consciousness, listening to the unconscious, integrating it, for example the world of dreams, and being able to incorporate it into ourselves until it becomes part of ourselves and our consciousness is no longer the dominant force in our psyche, but is in a dialogue with the unconscious and indeed often subordinate to it and listening to it. This individuation process, this combination, is a movement towards integration, and indeed typically in the last part of life, or the second part of life certainly, the movement towards the integration at a total level, the integration of the self, in which all the different components of the human being, you can see this for example in mandalas, where different parts of the system are incorporated in these beautiful circles drawn by Tibetans, for example. These mandalas represent the totality, the wholeness and the completeness of the self, to which the human psyche is somehow orientated towards, pushed as it were from within, unconsciously pushed towards this integration process of our consciousness with the unconscious. So the consciousness, having been separated off, now becomes integrated into a greater whole. But finally, to end this Visions of the 21st Century, I would like to take a vision not of the 21st century, but one that was curiously incorporated, which is the Dancing Shiva, but incorporated into the CERN laboratory as a gift from India, which is of the Dancing Shiva, which shows a great circle, which is the space-time continuum of the cosmos, and the hair of the yogi, who is the Dancing Shiva, stretching out to the edges of the cosmos. That is the act of contemplation and the act of consciousness stretching out to the beginnings of our universe and the full extent of our universe, which we've seen also in modern science as well as in contemplation and mysticism. The multi-handed Dancing Shiva has one hand on the one hand, and on the other it has the drum of creation, bringing creation into existence, and on the first it has the destruction, our process, the great fire, the drum and the fire bringing life into existence and destroying it. The other two hands, one sign of acceptance and the other pointing elegantly to the poise of the feet of the Dancing Shiva, of the legs, which are, one leg is balanced on the mighty dwarf, which is the ego. The ego therefore is subordinate to the greater self, who is connected to the cosmos and who is a totally integrated human being. I've suggested that if ever an image were to be sent out into space of the greatest aspiration of our human species, it should be this one rather than any other religious or spiritual symbol created by the human race. We hope that you have found this lecture on Visions of the 21st Century enjoyable and stimulating. It consisted of three parts. Firstly, the accelerating world of knowledge. Secondly, the crises, the evolving crisis of the 21st century and the proposed solutions, particularly in the world of ecology and energy. And thirdly, the new metaphysics which is emerging and the integrated human being which is now possible. If you wish for more information on these interesting topics, then please consult the website alanmulhern.com and go on to the Quest series section. Thank you. We hope that you have found this lecture on Visions of the 21st Century both stimulating and enjoyable. It consisted of three parts. Firstly, the accelerating knowledge of the 20th and 21st centuries. Secondly, the evolving crisis of our century and corresponding answers or visions offering solutions particularly to the energy and ecological crisis. And thirdly, the emerging new paradigm or new metaphysics offering a new worldview not only of the cosmos and of nature but of human consciousness. And finally, the possibility of an integrated human being who has an ethical system within which is integrated to the whole life system of a human being and indeed beyond that to the world. We ended with the vision of the Nataraja, which is the Dancing Shiva, which is a spiritual image from the East, which still has enormous value in the 21st century. We thank you for your participation, and if you want more information, please consult alanmulhern.com, the website, and go on to the Quest series section.